literally 2 weeks. And that, of course, means that Passover is in 2 weeks, which seems crazy because Passover doesn't seem. Well, that's what I was going to say. Mike jumped the gun, which if you heard him, he said that spring training just started too. Because as soon as Passover, like then I think baseball. It's weird, right? That's probably not a good thing. But it's just boring time right now. It's basketball time, and it's not a lot of. Oh, but there is a Jewish sports thing that happened today. The U.S. men's team is one game away from the gold medal. They won today, and the guy who won the game from Quinn Hughes is a Jewish hockey player. Yeah, Quinn Hughes. He's really good. And his brother plays too, the Hughes brothers. Yeah. So I think they're one game away from the gold game. So that's pretty cool. So there is a Jewish
Are they
sports.
the fighters?
What?
Are they the
Yeah.
brawlers?
Well, I don't know. I
Uh,
don't think no. I thought you said they're on the Flyers. No, they're on the Devils. One of them's on
no,
the
are they
Devils.
are they the brawlers?
I don't know. No, he's like a
Not particularly.
scorer, man. He's like a scoring guy.
Huh?
Jewish curler. Jewish curling. There might have been Jewish curling people we didn't know, by the way. Esther said we want some Jewish curling people. Yeah, it has not been a great Olympics for Israel. Israel had a bobsled team this year, which they didn't think was going to necessarily do good, but they didn't do well. But they had one, and then yeah, it hasn't been a stellar Olympics for the Jewish community. Anyways, but World Baseball Classic's coming up, and that's Jewish, or is Team Israel, because Team Israel in the World Baseball Classic has Harrison Bader, who unfortunately is on the Giants. It has Jock Peterson, who used to be on the Dodgers. I think he is. Actually, I'm not sure. Somebody told me he might not be. His brother, Tiger, is one of the coaches. We got an amazing coach lineup. Coach lineup is Ian Kinsler, Brad Osmus, and Kevin Youkilis. It's like all were great players. Anyways, but I wish they could still play. And we have one other. Oh, we have Dean Kremer from the Baltimore Orioles who's playing on the team, and he's pretty good. And he actually is from Israel. He's legitimately an Israeli baseball player, Dean Kramer. So, who? Jock Peterson. So he is on the team, right? Yeah. Well, I know his brother's coaching, so I would think he's. Yes, his brother Champ. Is her brother Champ, but Tiger played baseball, and he's one of the coaches. It's pretty cool. Anyways, so Jerry Narin is one of the coaches too. So, anyways, it's always fun. They're in like a horrible division. The Team Israel. They have to play against Dominican Republic and Venezuela. I mean, they're in a division that like is probably one of those teams has a chance of winning. Dominican Republic for sure, but yeah, it's tough. They called it. I forgot they called it like the division of death or something like that because of doom because they're so good. But anyways, Israel is still one of the few countries that has a team in the World Baseball Classic. So again, it's not Israelis for the most part. It's people who could be Israeli under Israel's right of return, which means they're Jewish. Garrett Stubbs, yeah, he's a backup catcher for the Phillies. Yeah, yeah. Mike's going through the people. We should have had Max Fried, but Max Fried didn't play. He would have been good. That guy's a stellar pitcher, Max Fried. Yeah, no, Max Fried's from the Valley, from Encino. Encino. I think he's from Encino. Oh, he went to Harvard Westlake. Yeah, Max went to, but my brother played with him in Encino Little League. What? So he's not. So Jock's not on it. His brother's coaching though, right? Tiger. All right, let's take a look tonight. Tonight is the fourth session of Jewish history. We're covering 1,000 years from about 400 to about 1500. And
Hey,
I will
Rabbi.
tell you, it's my least favorite period of Jewish history. 1,000
Hey,
years.
Rabbi.
Yes.
We are 7 months into this. 6 months into this.
I
Is
know.
that incredible?
I know. Well, last week we did the rabbinic period, which is my favorite period, the rabbinic and beginning of Christianity. Now, you notice we didn't talk that much about the Mishnah and Talmud last week, and that's because we talked about it already, and I didn't want to repeat myself. And if you want to go back to the Mishnah and Talmud class, it was like the third class we did, and we definitely did it. we definitely talked about the Mishnah and the Talmud, the rabbinic texts. We also didn't talk that much about Christianity, the rise of Christianity. We're going to have a separate class on that. Some of the history classes we got coming up, the next couple of ones. The next one is really the Enlightenment period and kind of through the Holocaust from about 1800 to 1945 or so. The last class, the sixth class, is from Israel, the birth of Israel to the modern era, the last 75 years, 80 years of Jewish history. Now, both of those classes, though, are going to be taught in some levels separately, because we're going to talk about the history of Israel separately in a few classes. We're going to talk about the rise of some of these things even today in separate classes. Like, so today we're going to be talking about the Jewish world in around 1000, but we're going to talk later about Yiddish and the development of Jewish languages, but like Yiddish and Ladino. But today we're covering it. But so some of this stuff we're going over a little faster because there are we're going to have a deeper dive into this. And especially, again, last week, not talking about the rise of Christianity, though, I mean, I mentioned it. During that rabbinic period, we had the rise of Christianity. And again, what really determines what happens today in today's class, which is the 1,000-year period of what we'd call the Dark Ages, which was the Dark Ages for much of the world, but for the Jewish community, it was really the Dark Ages. Some people have called it the Age of Faith because it was a time in history where faith communities kind of determined a lot, and it was really also in some ways called the Dark Ages because it was the end of the Roman Empire. So the first map that we have up here right now is a map of the Roman Empire. That red border around the outside and then everything in the orange was part of the Roman Empire. And what this map actually shows is the dispersion of the Jewish community from Israel, from the province of Judea, after the war was over, and when the Bar Kokhba revolt was over, and the Jewish community begins to spread out in what we call the exile, the Roman exile, the destruction of the Second Temple, and then the Jewish community spreading out throughout the Mediterranean. Some Jews went to Mesopotamia, went further east, but much of the Jewish community went west. And this area of the Roman Empire eventually gets split into two: a Western Roman Empire based in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire based here in Byzantium. So when the empire splits during the time of Constantine, Jews are in both parts. But you can see it wasn't just Europe, it was also North Africa that was under Roman, and then later on the inheritors, the Western and Eastern Empire. Now, sometimes those empires, the East and the West, got along, and sometimes they didn't get along. Jewish community was under both. And how Judaism survived during these times is an interesting one because, again, when Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, about 350 of the Common Era, Israel is already under Roman control. But interestingly, Israel itself, while the Christians maintain control, there are still Jewish communities living, especially in the north, in the northern part of Israel, in the Galilee, and in places that we've been to and that we're going to go to on our next Israel trip, places like Zippori, places like Tiberias, that have large Jewish communities in the 300, 400, and 500s under the Byzantine control, under that Eastern Roman Empire. They continue to thrive. They seem to do fairly well. There's definitely anti-Semitism in some cases, but for the most part, Jews are able to build synagogues. They're able to thrive. And around that time, there are more and more Romans, citizens, that have become Christian. And there's even, of course, Jews who've become Christian. But there's still almost an even balance between Christians and Jews within the land of Israel itself, within this area. But of course, as the Jewish communities spread, they're also facing this weird situation where into the communities that they go to, whether it's Asia Minor or Macedonia. All of this is happening in the hundreds of years. It doesn't happen overnight. I mean, this is literally hundreds of years the Jewish community makes its way to Italy. The huge Jewish community, after the Romans destroyed the temple, they brought a lot of Jewish slaves back. But there's also Jews that are migrating and moving to places in France, to places eventually even in Spain, in North Africa, which are all part of the Roman Empire, in some cases, again, the Western Roman Empire. And then these communities are at first dealing with pagans, but eventually, as these communities become Christian, they're now dealing with Christian authority. And so it happens in the land of Israel, or now again part of the Byzantine Empire, but it happens in all the other parts of the Eastern and Western Empire. And this goes on throughout the 500s and 600s. It goes all the way on as these kingdoms begin to arise. And what really happens in the East, the Eastern Empire continues to be ruled by Christian leaders who are based in Byzantium. They have actually an empire. The Eastern Roman Empire lives and succeeds to kind of like rule and exist in a continuity all the way up to 1453. So up until the 15th century, there's still a Christian monarch here in Byzantium who's ruling an ever-shrinking part of the world, but that Eastern Empire survives as a historic connection all the way back to Constantine. But in the West, no. In the West, as barbarian tribes eventually destroy the Roman Empire, you have what's really called, when people talk about the Dark Ages, they're really referring to what happens in Western Europe, where you have chaos, you have wars, you have lots of fighting between inheritors of these different parts of Europe, of Western Europe. So I'm talking about Italy, France, Spain, and these countries eventually, or nations, they start to kind of come up with their own policies about what's going to happen with the Jewish world. Now, Jews, for the most part, are continuing to exist. And here's the weird thing, and this is why this is not my favorite part of Jewish history. The Jewish community kind of continues in a stasis, kind of like not really changing a whole lot for most of this period. They're treated, by the most part, by these Christian monarchs with a certain kind of tolerance. We tolerate them. We're not going to let them get too powerful. We're not going to let them, kind of get too strong. And we're not going to let them own land. We're not going to let them be part of guilds, and we're not going to let them be part of society. But we'll allow them to continue to be here, especially to do things like money lending, doing some kinds of trade. And what's interesting is that the Jewish community is organized around rabbinic Judaism. It's organized around traditions that they are living under with a great deal of autonomy in some cases. People are leaving them alone, but they're literally living as almost independent communities within the countries that they live in, within these new Christian monarchies. And again, that's Spain, that's France, Italy, all these places. They're not called that yet. They're called, the Lombard, kingdom, or the biggest kingdom was the Holy Roman Empire, which was part of Germany and part of Italy. And there was 4 kingdoms just in Spain. So these kingdoms, would sometimes have better relations with the Jews, and sometimes it wouldn't be great. But the big change that happens, and again, looking at this map, is that eventually Islam, coming out of Arabia in about the 7th century, conquers Israel, right, and makes it part of the Islamic world. What's interesting is the Christians had built a church on the Dome of the Rock, where the Dome of the Rock is today, on top of the temple, at that holy place. But it was not a major church, which kind of tells you that at the time, Christianity really didn't view the temple as necessarily a holy place within their framework. It was not a place that Jesus spent a lot of time. They did build churches up in the Galilee, but the temple, the where the temple was interesting to them, but they weren't that concerned with it. The interesting thing is when Islam conquered that area, they knocked down the church that was there. Again, not an impressive, massive church. It wasn't like, here's our new temple. They knocked down that church and built what is today the Dome of the Rock and went through many changes as it eventually became the Dome of the Rock, but they built a mosque there and is, again, to establish their claim to the Holy Land. The Christians really didn't do that. They will later on during the Crusades, which we're going to get to. But when Islam comes through,
Rabbi,
yeah,
hold on, let me mute here. If you can go back to that other slide, shouldn't I mean, I don't know the source of this slide, but you know, I'm not an expert by any means, but you know, I have this thing. Really, shouldn't it be called Syria Palestinia?
where on this map,
Yes, I mean it's called Palestine, but it's you know, it would the Romans never called it Palestine ever.
yeah, but the only place, again, the Romans called it Palestine. That's a fact, and it wasn't that big of an area, right? It was not. It was not the area that they called Palestine. Syria, Palestine was not a large area. It was their determination of let's call it this area. But I like this map actually because it doesn't call it that right here. It focuses on the fact that it's Jerusalem, Caesarea. These are the areas during the Byzantine period were major areas for the Christians. And again, for the most part, the dots you see on here are major cities for the Jews. So you can see there was a large Jewish community by size. The size of the dot indicates how big the Jewish community was. So when but again, the focus is whatever the Romans called it. They didn't call it Judea anymore. That was a punishment to us. But here's what happens with the rise of Islam. Now, literally over a period of about 150 years, Islam, by again forcible conversion, conquers all of this is the area right here. It's really called Syria, which is why this map calls it Syria. The Arabs didn't call it Palestine for the most part, not at this time. They call it Syria, as the Romans had, as the Ottoman Turks will. Just because it's not that big of an area as a Palestine, as a Judea. It's more of a entity when they called the whole area Syria, which also included Lebanon, by the way. So you can see all of this green area is the Islamic conquest. The Umayyad Caliphate, which was the first caliphate, spread. It was a huge amount. Now, eventually, this caliphate splits up into many different Islamic smaller caliphates and smaller sultanates. This is the extent, though, of how far Islam goes. Now, you notice that this area right here, this like kind of peach color, this is what the Eastern Roman Empire looked like by that period, which it's large. It's most of what's today Turkey, which is now, of course, became the Ottoman Turks eventually when the Turks kicked out and destroyed the Ottoman Empire, what was left of the Byzantine Empire. But you can see how small it is. And then the countries over here, are really small. And they're not even like listed as countries because the Franks, which are Germanic tribes that eventually give rise to France, all of these areas here are still so small and so fractured that they're not empires. They're not even like nations to some extent. They're literally little kingdoms, little fiefdoms. But you can see how big the Islamic Caliphate was, and it goes all the way to Spain, right? Because the Muslims were able to go all the way to the border with France and were stopped there in one of the most, to some extent, one of the most determinant battles in history. Christian soldiers stopped the Islamic armies here in France, on the almost again where the border of France and Spain are today. So, what we can say is that a huge amount, this area still has a Jewish community. This area, I'm saying, the Asia Minor, this area around Italy still has a sizable Jewish community. But you could see many Jews now are living under Islamic control.
What's the
Not only
Lombard principalities? What is
Th-
that?
those are again, they were the the Lombards originally were Germanic tribes, were Germanic tribe too, who end up becoming powerful enough in Italy that they control a sizable part of Italy. There's still a part of Italy today called Lombardy, and
Mm.
if you Lombard Street in San Francisco is all named after the Lombards. But it's just showing you that again, for the most part, Europe is kind of a mess because everything that's up here, where it says the Avars, the Magyars are the ancestors of the Hungarians, the Khazars we'll talk about in a moment, the Bulgars, the ancestors of the Bulgarians. These are all tribes. These are all kind of like almost like again barbarian nomads still. But again, the Arabs are not able to conquer it. And when I say Arabs, yeah, they're Muslims, but they are led by Arab armies. There are other people that are now, Persian Muslims. There's even going to be Spanish Muslims. There's going to be North African Muslims. But for the most part, the leaders are Arab. Came out of Arabia, and in very short order, they were able to conquer much of what was the Roman Empire. And for a long time, Judaism flourished under Islamic caliphates for the most part. Again, there were occasionally outbursts of anti-Semitism. There were Muslim pogroms against Jews, but for the most part, Jews fared better under under the Islamic caliphate than they did in many of the Christian kingdoms, and especially in places like Spain here during the Middle Ages, which was called Al-Andalus, Andalusian, right? Is Al-Andalus was the Arabic name for it. So the word Andalusian, like Andalusian horse, that's Arabic. There's still some Arabic in especially in southern Spain, but Cordoba, Sevilla, they had very large Jewish communities. Toledo, amazing Jewish communities, and also here, of course, in this area, you have Damascus, you have Baghdad, you have lots of places that are Jewish communities in under Islamic control where there's major civilization going on. Hebrew poetry is being written. People literally go back, Jews go back to the Bible and use the language to create poetry during this period. They're very involved as the Arab these Arab cities like Cordoba, which about 1,000, so about 1,000, about 200 years after the Muslims conquered Spain. And Spain, by the way, was under Muslim control for about 700 years. That's a huge amount of time. Now, by the way, we know about the Inquisition, and we'll get to it. The Inquisition was not just targeting Jews. It also targeted Muslims who had been forced to convert to Islam and get them to stop practicing Islam because they were doing it too. But at the time, during around 1,000, about 10 to 15% of Spain is Jewish. And these cities, like especially Cordoba is one of the largest, most important cities in the world. Literally, Cordoba and Baghdad were like the equivalent of New York and London today. 1,000 years ago, Cordoba and Baghdad, and again, the Chinese will tell you that some of the cities in China were also major cosmopolitan areas and metropolitan areas of like 1 million plus people. But for cities that we can say are like cities that people would go to study, to engage in culture, to meet people from all around the world, Cordoba and Baghdad were two of the most important cities. And what's interesting is they had huge Jewish communities, And Jews were very involved with the sciences. They were very involved with philosophers. This is when we have one of those very important philosophers is Maimonides, Rambam, who lives during this period. And and Jews are again treated as second class citizens. I want to make it clear. Jews are second class citizens in the Arab caliphates. But being a second class citizen is far better than what happens in some of the Christian communities. And again, for people who lived in Cordoba, they spoke, if you were a Jew there, you spoke Hebrew, you spoke Arabic, you maybe spoke Spanish. I mean, these were very multicultural cities, and people did amazing things in them. And again, Maimonides is one of the most famous. Maimonides actually lives he's born in Cordoba, and he eventually has to flee. And some people are like, oh, he fled because of the Inquisition. No. When he fled, it was way before the Inquisition. He fled Cordoba during an Islamic pogrom against the Jews, where they were forced to convert to Islam or they were forced to leave. His family were not 100% sure, but it seems like they were forced to convert for a period of time, and then they fled. Now, they didn't go to a Christian country. They went to another Muslim country. At the time, the caliphate in Spain was different than the caliphate here in Fustat in North Africa, in what's today Cairo. Maimonides and his family settled in North Africa, and that's where he lived the rest of his life, working as a doctor and as a philosopher and as really one of the most amazing Jewish minds of all times. But he went from one caliphate to another because they got away from a very intolerant caliphate in Spain to a more tolerant one in northern Egypt. So again, you'll hear this a lot in the Arab world today, Muslim world sometimes. Again, you got to, I'll be specific. You'll hear it in both, because not every Muslim is an Arab. But one of the things that you'll hear is kind of and this is important because it's relevant for today. One of the things you'll hear from some people in the media or pretending to be historians is they'll say Jews were treated better by the Muslims than they were by the Christians. That may or may not be the case, but it's not like it was all roses under the Muslims. So it's not to say that one was treated better than the other. And for somebody to say, for example, well, there never was the Holocaust in a Muslim country. Yeah, okay. But you could also say they didn't have the technology. I don't know. I think October 7th proved that people who are Muslim can be just as violent and as depraved and as anti-Semitic as a Nazi. So I will say, be careful, because you'll hear it, and it's a weird kind of like historical spin that will make you kind of go, well, I guess the Muslims are better than the Christians. But it's a thought question you don't want to have to ask yourself ever, which is like, if you were a Jew during this period, and I mean for like 1,000 years, would you have rather lived under a Christian monarchy or an Islamic caliphate? They both were nightmarish. So I don't love this period because it's oftentimes, to me, a way of looking at like what's the better of two evils. It is not a good time for 1,000 years, politically, religiously, safety-wise, to be a Jew. So, again, it's not the darkest periods of anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. It reached its peak, and we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the Holocaust again in a separate session, probably 2 sessions. And we're going to Europe in June to pay tribute and to see it with our own eyes. But understand, the Holocaust is both a unique and you can't compare anything to the Holocaust, which is why I sometimes really take offense when people make Holocaust comparisons. On the other hand, it's also a part of a continuity that goes back to this period, which is anti-Semitism that is nationalized, that is ingrained in the community, that's legal anti-Semitism. And there's a direct line from the Middle Ages. And that's why when you go to a Holocaust museum today, they'll show you that Jews in the Middle Ages and Christian kingdoms had to wear yellow stars. The Nazis didn't invent a yellow star. They brought it back. Jews in Muslim countries were only allowed to do certain jobs. These are facts. And these were, unfortunately, to me, this was the situation that Jews oftentimes dealt with. Any questions, any comments about this? So around this time, we need to speak about what's going on in the center of Europe. Because we have this little area here, which is kind of on the border of today, Germany. This is the Rhine River, by the way. Beautiful, beautiful river. Goes through Germany. It's also very close to, this is France. We have some cities here that are the heartland. And if I showed you again on the map, it's kind of up in this area. It's an area where Jews start going to during the Roman period. But by about 1000, this is one of the heartlands of the Jewish community. Does anybody know what we call this area? Anybody? Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. Those were the main cities. Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. In Hebrew, they were called Shum because Speyer is a shin, Worms is with a vav, and Mainz is with a mem. This is Ashkenaz. This is Ashkenaz. This is the area that we call Ashkenaz. Now, Ashkenaz is mentioned in the Bible. And we're going to read it, actually, by the way, in about 3 weeks on our Tuesday morning class when we do the Table of Nations. I know, John, you love the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, where the world is divided into, we get to see who goes where did they come from? Where did these peoples come from, right? Well, Ashkenaz is mentioned in the Bible as a place that seems to be to the north of Israel. We're not really sure where it is. I'm going to be honest. There's speculation that it's the area that was called Scythia, which is during the biblical times was just above Asia Minor, above Turkey, kind of in the kind of Caucasus. But by the Middle Ages, the people who lived there said, this is the area that the Bible was talking about that was called Ashkenaz. Why? Well, it's north, but probably wasn't this far north. These are Germanic areas. And the Jews that live here find communities that they are very comfortable in. They're treated usually fairly well here for a good couple hundred years. And they develop a rich and vibrant community with schools, with yeshivas, with academies. And this area is where Yiddish developed as a German-Hebrew hybrid, and Aramaic too. And the Jews who lived in this area spoke the German of the time. It's called Mitteldeutsch, which Middle High German. And they spoke it, and they blended the Hebrew with their German. Now, 70% of Yiddish is German. But it's this Middle High German, which is an interesting thing for, I studied Yiddish for a little bit in college, and German linguists study Yiddish because they're interested in it because it froze a form of German that they can look at almost like it was, oh, that's the way people spoke our language 1,000 years ago, because Yiddish froze it. Yiddish took it and made it part of another language, so they kind of split it off. And so German linguists are fascinated with Yiddish. I mean, if you can be fascinated with linguistics because of this interesting piece of linguistic history. But the Jews were very much at home here for a long time. And it's in this area where, again, lots of study and texts are translated into Yiddish. In some cases, they're also taught in French and German. One of the great scholars from this area, he actually lived in France, a little further to the west, is Rashi. And Rashi is the acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki. He is a rabbi who does an amazing commentary on the Bible. And one of the things that he does in his commentary is he translates words. He translates a word in Hebrew into what the French and German of his time was, and so he'll help people understand what a word in the Bible means. So Rashi also teaches us a little bit about the language at that time too. But he was a winemaker. Rashi was a winemaker who also was a rabbi and a scholar, and he was one of the most important rabbis during this period, about 1,000 years ago. Again, Jews are pretty comfortable in these areas until the Crusades. And the Crusades really begins another chapter of the Middle Ages, because there are pogroms and there are attacks on Jewish communities before this, but nothing like what happens during the Crusades. And the Crusades happened around 1100, 1090s. And what happens is these areas, the Jewish communities in these areas, are devastated. There is a level of murder, rape, and pillaging that goes on in these areas, and there are testimonies. So we have them. We have the testimonies of what was happening during this time when these primarily, and again, it's not Germany because it's called Germany today. These are German little kingdoms. And the French, it's not necessarily like the France that we have today. Part of France was occupied during this time by England, and you know, it's not like a unified France and Germany like we think of today. But these kingdoms, as these Christian pilgrims and soldiers are leaving Europe, they kill every Jew they can get their hands on. And this begins a period of about 400 years, or almost 400 years, of really bad time for the Jews. The first part of the Middle Ages, from like 300 to about 1,000, for 600-700 years, things are not great, but they're okay, in the sense that compared to this is when it gets really bad. And so when we say the dark ages for the Jews, it's really around the beginning of the Crusades. And so the Jewish community is driven over the next 500 years, 400 years really, all over the place. All over the place. Because we have these Jewish communities that are thrown out of Germany in the 1100s as a response to the Crusades. And of course, then we have lots of other expulsions. So all of these dates here are expulsions when Jews were kicked out of a place. So there isn't one expulsion. There's not one crusade. There's almost a dozen crusades. But the really bad first crusade, which was, again, Christians trying to liberate Israel, the Holy Land, whatever you want to call it at the time, again, it was controlled by Muslims. And for about 100 years, they're able to kick out the Muslim rulers until eventually Saladin comes back in with his army and kicks the Christians out. The Jews, for the most part, during this period, are on the Muslim side on this. They saw what happened to their communities in Europe, and we don't want to have any part of that. But it wasn't good on the other side either. Saladin overall was actually pretty tolerant of the Jewish community and treated them well. But yeah, there were Jews that were murdered when the Christian armies sacked Jerusalem around 1090. There were Jews that were murdered in Jerusalem along with the Muslims. along with Christians. I mean, the Christian armies just went on a rampage and killed pretty much everybody. Look, one of the one of the Crusades, the only thing that the armies from France and Germany and Britain and Italy did is they sacked Constantinople. They literally destroyed Constantinople, which allowed the Muslims to come about 100 years later to finish the job. But yeah, the Christians sacked their own Christian brothers in Constantinople and turned it into I mean, literally turned it into a catastrophe because they couldn't get Jerusalem, but they sacked a Christian city instead. I mean, it's insane. The Crusades were a brutal time, and the Jews were oftentimes caught in the middle. Jews, I want to make this not too confusing, but I want to explain that the Crusades did something that changed the course of Jewish history, which we don't talk about a lot, only because we don't talk about this period a lot, anyways. But there was something that happened out of this, for better or worse, that you need to know. I don't want to focus on this too much, but since most of us are Ashkenazi Jews, I will tell you this. I'll get to this because I'm going to, we'll go back to Spain. But what happened is when the Jews were driven out of Ashkenaz, out of Germany and France during this period of time, they made their way east for the most part. And as Jews were driven out of other parts of Europe, including Hungary and Austria, and again, of course, Jews eventually went back to these countries during the next part of the history what we're going to talk about, the Enlightenment period. A lot of Jews from this area of Ashkenaz, Germany, right, France, Holland, they made their way to the east. And this is how we wind up here. When people say, how did so many Jews wind up in Poland? It's because the Poles saw what was going on with the Western Christians and said, these people are nuts. The Jewish community it's a highly intelligent, literate community, and they're killing them and they're driving them out. Let's get them here. Now, part of it was because the area was not very developed. Remember, Poland eventually ends up getting conquered by Russia over here. And that's why when we talk about our family histories, a lot of us will go, well, we were in Poland, but it was part of Russia, and it was part of Galicia, and it was that's this area right here. This is Galicia. This is Poland. This is Poland. This is, today it's Ukraine, at least for now, right? You got these places that you see in the news, and you also, there's Kiev, Zhytomyr, I have family, a lot of people, a lot of Jews lived in these cities, Ternopil, Lublin. These are some of these places we're going to go on our trip. This is how they wound up there. The Crusades drove them to the east. Now, we're going to talk about it at the beginning of next class. The Poles used the Jews for the most part as a middle class. And I mean legitimately a middle class. Because the Polish nobility, who took advantage of, again, the fact that this Jewish community was looking for a place to live, allowed the Jews to live in the area. They were not allowed to own land. The Poles owned, the Polish nobility owned the land, but they had peasant workers, peasant farmers that farmed the land. Basically, the Jewish responsibility was to collect rents and collect the money from the farmers, from the tenant farmers who worked the land. And Jews worked, because they couldn't own the land, primarily as the middlemen and as literally the middle class. They ran taverns. They ran stores. Things where, again, they could be merchants and things that would eventually kind of determine, why Jews do these things up until recently. That happened in Poland. Now, I will say this, and we'll talk about it at the beginning of class next time. this leads to tremendous amounts of anti-Semitism in that area. And so when people talk about Polish peasants hating the Jews, it's because they were resented as a middle class, as a class that was there to essentially make sure that they paid their bills. And they resented them. And so when there were Polish uprisings, and we end up having a lot of really, really bad anti-Semitism and pogroms that go on because of the role that the Jews play in those areas. They're literally put into a situation where people hate them, where the average peasant hates them. And the weird thing is a lot of the Polish peasants who live in the area, who are the farmers, they're the people who actually live there. The Polish nobility, a lot of them don't even live in Poland. They live in France, they live in Western Europe, and they live in the States where they're getting their money sent to them every month, but they don't even live in the country. So oftentimes they have to kind of step in, with letters and with notes and say, hey, stop attacking the Jews in those areas. They're doing our job. They're doing the job for us. So it's not also a great situation, but it's far better. And quite frankly, Jews are not allowed to live in this country. Germany, well, it's not a country, but in these areas, in these kingdoms, they're not allowed to live there for 400 years. Were there Jews who lived there? Yes. There were Jews who lived illegally in these places and were sometimes given permission to do business because people relied on Jewish business. Because one of the things that the Jewish people were able to do during this period was create international monetary connections all across these areas. If Jews stayed behind, there was now a connection in that place. And not only that, you had a connection that literally linked the entire world because those Jewish communities would communicate with each other. They would, in some cases, have marital connections, and those connections create an international Jewish trade route, which allows people to do business literally for the next 500 years. The forced expulsion of Jewish communities from one place to the other creates a community of international finance and international trade. When people say, like, so why? Because you made us do it. You didn't give us a choice. And so these expulsions, 1290, the Jews of England are kicked out in 1290. That's about, you can see that's 200 years after the Crusades. They were Jews that were still living in England during the First Crusades. So Richard the Lionhearted, supposedly Richard had relations, fairly positive relations with the Jewish community, but his descendants didn't. And King Edward, the one who finally kicks the Jews out, he's a horrible man. He's the one who also, if you watch Braveheart, he's the one who puts down the Scots. He's not a good man, to say the least. He's the one who drives the Jews out. And literally for the next 400 years, until 1660, so 370 years, Jews are not allowed to openly live in England. Now, did they? Yeah, probably a few. Maybe some conversos, some Spanish Jews that had outwardly, converted to Christianity, but were still practicing Judaism. But they were not openly allowed. There was no synagogue in England until the 1600s, late 1600s. Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, was the guy who let the Jews back. So you understand that Jews literally, the country that my wife was born in, and I've been to York. There was a horrible pogrom against the Jews of York in 1290 when they were forced out, where the Jews of York were rounded up and you can go there. I've been there. You go to the York Castle, and the Jews were burned alive at York Castle in 1290. I mean, that's a part of English history. And to know, again, my wife's family came from Poland and Russia, like mine. They came in the 1880s, 1900s to England when Jews started. We'll talk about that when we get to that time next week. We'll talk about the waves of immigration. But I mean, how do you comprehend that for a second? To be born in a country where that's part of your history. Yeah, John. Yes, John.
Sorry. I have to mute, so it's a whole process.
Yeah.
No, you answered my question. I wanted to know where Tracy had come from. You know,
Yeah.
where
But she
where
but
her
she's
family.
Ashkenaz. Her family came from here, from Poland and this area like mine did. So so go back to this map. Of course, we didn't talk about the worst expulsion. We have to talk about it, and we're going to kind of finish with it tonight. That is, of course, what happens here in Spain. Now, part of it, as I mentioned, was
Is it true that the Jews paid the ransom for Richard Lionhearted?
that's a legend. That's a
Okay.
legend, but we don't know. It could be based on truth that the Jews paid for Richard the Lionhearted to get out of. He was captured on his crusade, and and there's all these myths about it. It's in Robin Hood. You see the Sean Connery got to play Richard in one of the movies. So there's so little known about Richard, really, about the real guy. Some interesting speculation, though, by the way, that again he was a little bit more tolerant of the Jewish community than other English kings. That he might have been gay. That we know one thing about Richard: he didn't like living in England. He only spent a few months of his entire life in England, and it's ironic because he's considered to be like this great English hero. He didn't like England, and he didn't like speaking English. He spoke French, and we know that. I mean, those are some things we know about Richard. But he was considered one of the great warriors, and but yeah, he's an interesting guy, and we don't know for sure how favorably inclined he was to the Jews, but it seems like he was more than some of his predecessors and definitely some of the people who came after him. But when we look at what happened in Spain, it was, as we said, part of it was Spain dealing with a reclamation of its country from Islam. Because 1492, we know, is the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's also the year that the Jews were finally kicked out of Spain. It was also the year that Granada fell to the Christian armies. Granada was the last holdout. The Alhambra, the beautiful Alhambra, was the last holdout for Muslims when the Christians surrounded Granada and made them surrender. That's when Spain could finally say, we're free of this. No more Muslims and no more Jews. And remember, this had been going on for hundreds of years.
Wasn't there something recently too? They proved that
I will
Columbus.
get
Oh,
to that.
okay. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to
I'm getting
remember.
to that. I'm getting to that. But yes, so what happens here is that the Jews are literally over hundreds of years given the choice of converting to Catholicism, to Christianity, and then again, then you can be integrated into Christian society. The problem was, and it's very well documented, that the Christian society did not treat the Jews who converted very nice. They did not treat them with a lot of respect. They called them nuevos cristianos, the new Christians, and they did not think that they were legitimate because they knew that people were forced to convert. And a lot of them were still practicing Judaism in secret. They were what we call conversos or crypto Jews or Marranos. But Marrano is not a nice word. It's like a pig. We don't want to call them Marranos because that was what the Spanish called them. But it was a real problem. It was a real problem in Spain because they had forced these people to convert, and they didn't want to convert, but they had to. So, come on. They were still practicing Judaism secretly. Again, we don't talk, it also happened to the Muslims. They were called Moriscos, Moors, Moriscos. Moriscos were also, and again, Morisco means something else in America because we called Native Americans who were mixed mestizo, or sometimes were called Morisco. The original Moriscos were Muslims who were forced to convert to Catholicism as well, and were still practicing Islam in secret. Many, you can imagine. If the country was at one point like mostly Muslim, you could imagine there were a lot of people whose ancestors at one point were Muslim. And again, there are a lot of Spaniards who have an ancestor or two who was Jewish. If 10% of Spain was Jewish in a 1000 era, around that time, do the math. After 500 years, the multiplication, the way that those genes spread is, again, there's a huge part of Spain that has Sephardic ancestry. And again, we call Spain Sepharad in Hebrew. It was another area that's mentioned in the Table of Nations. It probably was not this far away, but the Jews of Spain call themselves Sephardim. Now, that is one of the things that comes out of the Middle Ages, a Sephardic and Ashkenazic tradition out of Europe, where prayers are slightly different, where there's different melodies, where there's different foods. Everyone follows the Talmud. Everyone follows rabbinic law. There are slight variations in the way certain holidays are kept, but the dates of the holidays are the same. A lot of the basic practices are the same, and there's a lot of sharing going on between the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities. It's not like they're totally separate. The Sephardim go all the way into France, and the Ashkenazim are in France. So there's like parts of France where Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews are studying together. And of course, eventually, at the end of the Middle Ages, when the Spanish, the final expulsion happens, a lot of those Jews will make their way to over here in Israel. And we talked about this when we talked about Kabbalah. The Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews met in Israel. They met in Sfat in the 1500s and gave rise to the Kabbalah, gave rise to things like Lachadodi and those prayers that they wrote. Sephardic influence and also Ashkenazi. And we talked about the Rabbi Luria, who was part Sephardic, part Ashkenazi. So you had people who were, who had both ancestries. Now look, again, the Spanish situation was going on over hundreds of years. The Inquisition had started before 1492. The Inquisition and the expulsion are different things. The Inquisition had started 200 years before. It's impossible to think about the Inquisition without thinking about Mel Brooks. It's really a problem. And I just saw the movie, the Mel Brooks documentary, and he talks about it. He talks about the flack that he got for making fun of the Inquisition. And it was. You look at it today, it's so subversive, it's so problematic, making fun of Jewish. But look, he made fun of the Holocaust. So it's not like he did, it's not like he hadn't, there wasn't something he was going to do with that was not going to be offensive. But there is a point about this, which is it was part of our consciousness to know that even if we converted, it didn't matter. And that, at its basis, will be something that we'll talk about, especially when we get into what happened during World War II, which is that there's a level to this that's not religious. There's a racial and ethnic component to Judaism, which does not allow somebody to convert. Nazis didn't care if you converted. And to some extent, the Spanish made the Jews convert, but they never stopped reminding them of who they were. And as long as they did, as long as the Inquisition continued, and it continued well after the 1492, the Inquisitions were still going on, not only in Spain, but in North America into the 1800s, South America, Mexico. There were places where Inquisitions were going on into the 17 and 1800s. As long as the Inquisitions were going on, as long as there were Jews being rounded up for practicing Judaism and Judaizing, it continued. As soon as it stopped, the Jewish practices stopped. Interesting psychological factor here, which is that when people don't want you to do something, you do it. And that's what happened. I mean, we know it happened. When the Inquisition started It was really, of course, bad in Spain. And many people point out that the reason it started in Spain in the first place was because the Spanish government, the monarchy, owed the Jews so much money that they had to come up with a solution. That's true, but obviously the Catholic Church allowed it to happen. So it wasn't just done by the monarchy, it was done by Catholic leaders, by priests. Junipero Serra, the guy that explored California, he was an inquisitor too. This is not like there wasn't one Torquemada as the guy who's famous, right? That he's even in Mel Brooks's skit, Torquemada, but he actually plays Torquemada, Mel Brooks. But it wasn't one guy; it was thousands of priests that cooperated and were part of this. So they would torture people, they would kill people, they would force confessions, and it was horrible. But what's weird is when Jews left Spain, they oftentimes immigrated to other Christian countries. And what we know, and what Gail was going to, again, kind of make me get to, was that the Jewish community, here's the crazy thing, they found a better existence in Italy, of all places, like, 150, 200 miles from Rome, where the Pope was, where the Catholic Church was based. It was safer to be a Jew in Italy than it was in Spain. And one of those people, we know for a fact now, it's been proven, was Christopher Columbus. His parents were Jews from Spain who had fled to Genoa, right here in Italy. And they fled there to get away from the Inquisition. Now, it seems as though they were Catholic. Seems as though
Did
Columbus
we find it from
considered
DNA?
himself a Catholic. What?
Did we find it from DNA or something? How did
Yes,
we find
the
out that?
DNA proved that he was. We always
Yeah,
knew it was,
yeah,
but
but they
but this
argued.
proved it. This proved it. And what it proved was that, again, the Jews, and again, look, we knew he was from Spain, right? The Italians claim him because he was born in Genoa. He was born in Italy. But he spoke fluent Spanish because his parents were Jews from Spain who fled and settled in Italy, like lots of other people. Why were like this is how I knew he was Jewish. Who else left Spain and settled in northern Italy for some random reason? It didn't happen. It happened because a huge group of Jews from Spain immigrated to Genoa and established a community there. Now, how much of his Judaism did he practice in secret? How much of it was part of his consciousness? We don't know.
Well,
We don't.
don't we think that some of
It's
his crew was Jewish?
what?
No, no. Don't we think some of his crew was
We
Jewish?
know his crew was
Yeah,
Jewish. We're going to
yeah.
get
Okay.
there. We're going to get to that.
Okay, I'm
So
sorry.
when he goes back to Italy to Spain from Italy, again, the Italians loved him. He's the Knights of Columbus, right? Because he's Italian, but he's Spanish. The Spanish knew he was Spanish. The Spanish have always claimed him, and he was a Spanish guy born in Italy who's a Jew. He's a Spanish Jew who was born in Italy. When he went back to Spain and convinced the Spanish government to be part of that exploration of, again, what's he trying to do? He's trying to get to China. He's trying to get to India. He's trying to get to Asia by sailing that direction. He doesn't know he's going to hit the New World. When he convinces them to do it, the people who bankroll him, the king and queen, right, Ferdinand and Isabella, they had stolen all their money that they had in the Spanish treasury at the time from Jews. But some of the people who were part of the inner circle were they were new Christians who were part of the finance team, like the secretary of the treasury, were people who were also happened to be a generation or two before Jewish. So we know that these people financed it. We know that people essentially stole the money from the Jews in order to finance it in the first place. And when he set sail from Spain, from down here, his crew is almost entirely made up of Spanish Jews who are conversos, who are trying to get away. Now, you say, well, why? Why do we know that? Because the day they leave is the day the Jews were expelled from Spain. And they actually wait a day because the day that they were actually expelled was Tisha B'Av. And because Tisha B'Av was already a dark day, and you're not supposed to start new journeys on Tisha B'Av, the crew actually waits a day in Spain before they take off. And then they
But
take off.
both the Spanish and Italy have all said no, he wasn't a Jew. They argued that for years until the DNA came out.
Yeah, well, the DNA. So the DNA, what the DNA proved is that he wasn't Spanish or Italian. He's Jewish, but he was a Jew from Spain, right? So his crew is almost entirely these Christians who are afraid of their background. One of them literally just converted to get on. Luis de Torres had just gone through conversion to be part of the crew. He had been Jewish the day before. And he was brought on as a translator because he spoke Hebrew, he spoke Aramaic, and the one thing that Columbus knew is if he gets over to India and if he gets over to China, there's a good chance that there's going to be a Jew there. Why? Because they're everywhere. He is not sure he's going to find somebody who speaks Italian or Spanish or some European language. He's almost positive he's going to find somebody who speaks Hebrew or Aramaic. And Luis de Torres did. Luis de Torres is on that crew. He sails with them to China, India. They don't get there. They get to Cuba instead. And he discovers a whole new world, right? Luis de Torres never went back. He never goes back to Spain. He's one of the first Europeans that ever settled in the New World. We don't know what happened to him, but he was a Jew who decided not to go back because we know he didn't go back. Now, could have died, he could have been killed, we don't know. But one of the first Europeans that ever settles in the New World is Luis de Torres. Now, again, we don't know. We don't know that there's people who are descendants from him. We don't have that information. But we know who he was. We know a little bit of his story. And we know that it's not just that crew. Almost every one of Columbus's crews and almost every one of his the successor crews of other Spanish explorers, people like Balboa and Pizarro and all these other people you read about in the history books, almost all of them had a majority of their crew were Jews. People who wanted to get as far away from the Inquisition as possible. And what was crazy is that the Inquisition followed them to the New World. Now, if you ask, why did it follow them? Because the Spanish government knew that they were there. You don't have the Inquisition there. You don't have an Inquisition in Lima, Peru, unless there's Jews there. Look, the problem of what happened, and it's a weird story, is by the time, and it's really, again, when we get to the American Jewish experience, if the Inquisition had continued for another 50 or 100 years, by the time the Jews got here and were able to kind of settle in America in significant enough numbers, those crypto Jews that were under Spanish control, under Mexican authority, whatever, again, the successor states were, the Bolivian, the Colombian, whatever, they would have found a Jewish community that would have been able to connect with them. By the time the Jewish communities came in the late 1800s and 1900s, the Inquisitions had pretty much stopped, and that kind of practice stopped. And so you have a lot of people today across the Southwest and other parts of South America who know that they have maybe some Converso ancestry, but they lost it. There was maybe a generation or two, if they had linked up, there would have been a connection, a reconnection. But for the most part, the people who are rediscovering their Sephardic ancestry, their connection, have to do it through gene testing and through like legends within their family that somebody lit Shabbat candles and they didn't eat pork, or those kind of like little family legends. But the actual connections between these Jews, look, in all fairness, after hundreds of years, 200 years, a lot of this became very tenuous anyways. You know, one family member telling somebody that you're really Jewish, you know, that maybe will last for a couple of generations, but even still, like, what does it mean? It just becomes just like a story rather than, still practices and things that people did. But I hear about it from people from Hispanic backgrounds all the time that say, our family, we think we were Jewish. So, I mean, look, you can do a DNA test, you can find out, but it's kind of sad because it got broken. So during this time, up to the 1500s, which is kind of this was this will set the stage for what we have in the next period, what we're going to get to in this next week. But yeah, for about 1,000 years, from about 500 to 1500, expulsions, trying to find a home, trying to find a place where we just get left alone. When we talk about why the United States is such a has been such a special country for us for so long, for hundreds of years now, and we're coming up now again onto 250 years of Jews living in America as a country that's based on at least some of our values, not a lot of our values. It was not a good ride. And it's hard for me when I look at this history to say, what were the good parts about it? Well, look, I mean, there was writing, there was continuity. I mean, the Jews were able to stay, they were able to stay alive. They were able to, develop mysticism. They were able to develop texts. They were able to, but I got to tell you, their greatest accomplishment, staying alive. Staying alive, being able to adapt, being able to figure out what you have to do in order to ride this out. And that's the determining, if you want to know what's the determining theme of this period, survival. It's
resilience.
Yeah. And this idea that you can burn down our house, you can chase us out of the country, but we'll start again, and the stuff that we have that'll keep us going, you can't take away from us, which is our traditions and our laws. And when you see it in the end of, when you see the Jews of Anatevka rolling out of town, that's what this is a continuation of. Now, again, there are other things at play by that point. The we'll talk about it next week. The Haskalah, the emergence of Jews being integrated into society. Obviously, there's communism. There's other stuff going on in that area that are also at play. But man, that scene in Anatevka, that's what this is. That's what this is. That's Jews being chased from one place to the other. And we live there. I mean, you think about this, going back to this map. I mean, we came out of here, right? We came out of here. And again, how many of us had, like, what was the journey that your family made to get you to eventually to America at some point? I mean, you probably went to Italy, and then you went to Germany, and then you went out to Poland and Russia, and then you came here. There were probably other stops along the way to get you to that place. If you were a Sephardic Jew, remember I want to make this point. When the Jews were exiled from Spain in 1492, a lot of them, as I said, came back to Israel. They came back to Asia Minor. The Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, welcomed them. The Ottoman Turks said, Spain's loss is our gain. That's what they said.
They also went to Holland, lots of them.
They did. But they went to this area, to Asia Minor, to Greece, to all this area that was under Thessalonica, huge Jewish community, until the Holocaust. They came into this area, and they lived in Egypt. They lived in lots of parts of the Ottoman Empire. But yes, some of the ones from Spain made their way to Holland, and the Dutch community there. We talked about some of those people like Spinoza. These were Sephardic Jews who made it to Holland, and then some of them went to Britain. Some of them went to Great Britain. Some of them still live in Holland. But some of them from Holland made their way to the New World. And the first Jews that leave in 1600 to eventually make their way to the United States, to New York, were Dutch Jews. Now, they didn't come right from Holland. They were living in Recife in Brazil in a Dutch colony. But when the Portuguese took over that Dutch colony, the Jews said, this ain't a place for us. 1600s, and we'll get to it kind of next week. Jews were kind of caught in the they didn't want to be under Portuguese or Spanish control. So they got on their boat. They were going to head on up to the next Dutch colony, and they ended up going to the New World. They ended up going to the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam. And who knows? Who knows what would have happened to them if they had been thrown out of Brazil? That community, maybe the next community of Jews that were escaping it. But again, a lot of these Jews from
Well, how did they end up in South Africa? Did they come from
no,
Holland?
for the most part, the Jews of South Africa are from Poland, and huge influx of people during World War II, during fleeing the Nazis, and South Africa is one of the few countries that people could get into occasionally during that period of time. But they also started coming there at the turn of the century when the British were in control of South Africa. They were letting Jews from Poland and Russia come there too. But yeah, the Jews of America, the first Jews that came, were almost always Sephardic Jews, and they were people who a lot of them were Dutch, had lived for a while in Holland, and they stayed in Western Europe. Some of them went to England. Some of them, again, finally in the 1600s, got to go back to England. But the Sephardic community were the first Jews that went back to Britain. They were the first Jews that came to the New World. And the Sephardic Jews were major players in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, right?
Holland.
Curacao, the island of Curacao, had a huge Jewish community and still has the oldest Jewish synagogue in continuous use in the Western Hemisphere, is in Curacao, the Dutch Antilles. And so St. Thomas is the oldest synagogue in the United States that's still
older than
used.
Toro.
Curacao is the oldest in the Western Hemisphere, and it's Dutch, and it's and the Jews that lived in Holland, that some of them, again, that they were almost always Sephardic. Eventually, Ashkenazi Jews moved to Holland, but the first Jews that were there in the 16, 17, and that's why if you go to Amsterdam today, you can go to the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. It's a beautiful synagogue, about 400-year-old synagogue. You can see it's one of the most beautiful synagogues in Europe. I mean, it's not ostentatious or anything, but it's very special, and it's very similar to the Sephardic synagogues. You'll see it, the one in Providence, in Curacao, and some of those places you'll see that Spanish Portuguese style. And
now Holland, they were bankers, right? They were the middle class. They were merchants.
yes.
So did they want the Jews because they were bankers too, and they were merchants?
Yes, and in Holland they didn't care about anything other than money. The Dutch were really, really good at making money. For a little country, they were massively powerful. You know about the Dutch East and West Indies. The Dutch West Indies Company was a major corporation that owned countries. I mean, this, you talk about, like, Elon Musk and people today who have great wealth. This is a corporation. The Dutch West Indies Company was a corporation that ran colonies in Indonesia, in the Caribbean, and in New Amsterdam. That was run by a corporation. That was run as a business. The Dutch didn't treat it like a monarchy, like a royal colony. They treated it as a business. Everything that they ran it with a board. They ran it with a board of directors. They ran it with people who looked at the bottom line. They didn't care about making people Christian. They didn't care about, establishing missions and things like that. They just wanted to make money. And for a little tiny country, that country ended up having a huge amount of wealth until pretty much everyone took it away from them. The British, the French, the Germans, everyone took a little piece of, they basically said, Holland, you're not big enough to control this stuff. But they did for a long time. And again, one last thing, the Jewish merchants and the people who went with the Dutch to the islands originally. Again, some people know this. Alexander Hamilton, his first teachers there in Nevis, Dutch colonies, and England. Eventually, the English took it. Were Jews. There were Jews. He was taught at a Hebrew school, Alexander Hamilton, because in the islands, the Jews had a major role to play, and we now have kind of come to terms with the fact that a lot of the early pirates that worked, the privateers that worked in the Caribbean, the original pirates of the Caribbean, a lot of them were Jews. And the reason why the British and the Dutch used them was because they hated the Spanish. And they were only too happy to raid Spanish properties and Spanish ships, Spanish galleons, because they knew that these Spanish people were responsible for the Inquisition and responsible for kicking their families out of Spain in the first place. So a lot of these Jewish pirates were exacting revenge on the Spanish. And so the English and the Dutch used them as pirates because they knew that they couldn't stand them. So yeah, it's part of the history now that's also kind of been written about and spoken about recently. But it's an interesting and I'm actually talking to the people in Curacao next week, the Jewish community there, about what's going to happen there for one of their upcoming anniversaries. But again, it's an amazing. I haven't been to the synagogue in Curacao, but it is an amazing synagogue and has an amazing history. So there you go.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
Rabbi, I was always told the oldest synagogue in the United States was the Toro Synagogue, and it's
In
not in
Providence.
Providence. It's in Newport.
Yeah. Yeah. Newport.
Uh,
Yeah. Sorry.
if
Yeah, Newport, Rhode Island, and it is gorgeous. It's a gorgeous synagogue. It's the oldest continuously used building. It's not the oldest. The Sherit Israel Synagogue that is in New York was the original Sephardic synagogue, but it's not there anymore. The Sherit Israel Synagogue still exists on the Upper West Side, but it's not in the same building. So the Touro Synagogue is the oldest synagogue in the continental United States. The St. Thomas Synagogue is actually older, but it's not in the continental United States. What?
the Torah synagogue, by the way, was founded by Sephardics. I mean, that's
Yeah, yeah. No, that's what we're
kind
saying.
of,
All the synagogues in the New World, and I'm talking about North America, South America, the islands, all of the first synagogues, all of them were Sephardic. There wasn't one that wasn't. So the first synagogues in Charleston, South Carolina, were Sephardic. It's because, again, there were very few Ashkenazi Jews that made it to the New World. If they did, they went to a Sephardic synagogue. There weren't enough Ashkenazi. There were not enough German Jews in this country until about the 1800s to even have an Ashkenazi synagogue. I'm telling you. And that's not quite true. There was already in Philadelphia, there was some Ashkenazi synagogues in the 1700s, but for the most part, and again, in Philadelphia, Mikveh Israel, Sephardic, they're all Sephardic. There was no part of the United States that was settled by Jews where there was a Jew. They were Sephardic. So just, I mean, that is a fact. Again, it's not, we obviously we concentrate a little bit more on the Ashkenazi community, but because that's what most of us are. But yeah, the Sephardic Jews were there. Now, again, there aren't many people that can trace themselves back to those Ashkenazi Sephardic Jews, but they were here first, no doubt. So next week we're going to read about the Enlightenment period, the Haskalah, and it's really going to be from like the 1700s to about 1945. So this was 1,000 years. We're going to cover about 200 years, and some of it we've talked about in the Kabbalah class about that, but we're also going to talk about it a little bit more in detail and explain to some extent it's the coming out of this period and what happens when Jews get reintegrated back into society. But of course, it ends in a not very easy way because we are going to finish next week with the Holocaust. Yeah.
Before we go, when I didn't interrupt you when we were talking about England and leaving England and York. Sharon and I were there. We went through the story and the locations and so on. The following night, we found a hotel wherever we're having breakfast, and a couple across the room from us looks at us and asks if we're Jewish. Yeah, we're Jewish. They were Jewish. And we, I don't remember the details, and if I get it wrong, somehow I think the phrase goyim came up, and the wife of the couple said, "We refer to them here as Yorks."
Yawks.
Yorks.
Yawks. Yawks.
Yorks.
Yawks. Not Yorks, Yawks. Yes.
Yorks.
Yes, that's a word my wife used to use. She doesn't use it anymore. Look, you shouldn't use either word, right? But it's not it's not usually meant complimentary. And by the way, it's been reappropriated by anti-Semites now who are now, if you've heard the discussion about the word goy slop is look it up. Look up goy slop. The term Goyslop. Goy slop is considered to be the anti-Semites use it as a term to describe the garbage information that Jews put out in the media so that Gentiles get stupid. So feeding people goy slop is a Jewish conspiracy. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, look up the word goy slop. It's being used all the time now.
Anybody who gets an opportunity, by the way, to go see Toro Synagogue, it's worth it because Newport is one gorgeous place.
Yeah.
The synagogue is not only completely refurbished, they've taken extremely good care of it. They still conduct all of their services. They are pretty much an Orthodox synagogue. And one of my best friends, Cheryl Shernack, grew up at that synagogue. So
yeah, Newport's a gorgeous place.
It's certainly worth the trip.
And we will maybe next week, if not next week, the week after, look at the dedication, the letter that George Washington wrote to the dedication of that synagogue. It is one of the classic texts of American Judaism. We should have a field trip there. Yeah, absolutely. No, listen, we were in Newport a couple of years ago, and we made sure we saw the synagogue. I actually did an opening of one of our Shabbat services there because I wanted to, remind people that it's really a great American treasure. But we're not there yet. That's 1700s, and but it's built in the Spanish-Portuguese style, and very similar to the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in Holland. So hopefully you'll get to go there too. We're not doing a trip to Holland right now, and the synagogues that we're going to in Europe this year are, they're all Ashkenazi. But we're going to the Dahain in Budapest, one of the most beautiful synagogues. Yeah, there's a couple synagogues that are the most beautiful to see in the world, and the Dahain is one of them. And the Rome synagogue is definitely one of the others, and Florence synagogue is gorgeous, but there's a few, and I would say that the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam and maybe the Toro synagogue are some of the classic synagogues to see. All right, folks, have a good rest of the week. We are having Shabbat with Rick and Addie this Friday, and then we will hopefully see you next Tuesday or Wednesday. Or both. For classes. But
Rabbi, how do you spell
We'll be
Goyslop?
online only. 100%.
Rabbi, how do you spell Goyslop?
What?
How do you spell
Goyslop? Yes. I wasn't going to bring it up, but it's an interesting thing to look at. You should know about it. Oh, it's a new word. All right. Take care, everybody. No,
Bye-bye.